Let's get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very excited to share with you all some of our ideas and insights on these topics of science fiction, futures literacy, and technological innovation. Together with me today is Roger Spitz, who will be presenting himself in a while. But just to introduce myself first, my name is, Lydia Zuin. I am a Brazilian journalist. I hold a master's degree in semiotics, and I'm finishing my PhD in visual arts currently. I'm also a senior researcher at Envisioning, who is hosting this panel with us. And I am also chair of Center for Science Fiction at Disruptive Futures Institute, alongside Roger. Some of the themes I have been studying for the past 10 years include topics such as transhumanism, science fiction. I am both a writer and a researcher. And besides emerging technologies, consumer behavior, and I also use methodologies such as NASA's TRL, which means technology readiness level, and we will address this methodology along the panel, and also design fiction as a means to discuss future scenarios. So now it's Roger.
Fantastic. Nothing as interesting as Lydia, but I'll give it a shot. So I spent 20 years in investment banking. I was advising shareholders, CEOs, and boards on some of the strategic transactions, venture capital, acquisitions, divestments, strategic investments, and covering globally technology sector for that. So I'm now seeking forgiveness and redemption and trying to do something more interesting than all that. I still spend time, I'm based in San Francisco, still spend time with a lot of the companies and the VC world and startups here in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. And my primary focus today, having left investment banking after 2 decades, is foresight strategy through tech essential, which is technology and existential as an aim. And I work a lot with boards and investors and work a lot on the future of leadership, future of governance, and ethics foresight, technology foresight, and those topics. And what Lydia mentioned as the Disruptive Futures Institute is it's a think tank and platform where we try to help understand, anticipate, and navigate disruption. We believe that disruption has become a steady state as opposed to a single or recurring event. While most of the world continues to see educational systems and businesses and governments operate as if the world was stable, was linear, was predictable. So we integrate futures and foresight, complexity and systems thinking, science fiction, as well as philosophies and Buddhism, and areas such as exponential technologies to try and help provide tools to drive and to thrive on disruption, to understand how to deal with what is a complex, nonlinear, and unpredictable world. But that's okay. Those are actually good things. It helps you with agency, inspiration. It helps you with curiosity and experimentation. So we see it as a very positive element to drive imagination and agency. So on that note, I think Lydia will want to introduce our hosts Envisioning, who are organizing this session with us.
Yes, exactly. So at Envisioning, our purpose is to be able to amplify voices, ideas, knowledge, build new skills, and allow people to structure intelligent alternatives for the future. We want to encourage people to go further, to overcome poverty of the imagination, and to rethink behavior, applying creative and innovative initiatives to deconstruct certainty of the present and create a new future. This involves thinking strategically, doubting, talking, understanding people, politics, and culture. We are the world's first collaborative intelligence platform for emerging technologies. And we have a global team spread throughout the world in countries such as Brazil, United States, Germany, Spain, and so on, always growing. And here are some of our clients. And basically what we do is mapping emerging technologies and ranking them according to levels of readiness, both NASA's technology readiness level and a proprietary methodology of readiness for technologies. And what we do is trying to identify technologies that could be one science fiction, and then they can become more than ideas to become concept, and then a prototype and a product. So it goes from science fiction to science fact. We have a platform with more than 1,000 technologies, emerging technologies that we analyze in terms of readiness, and if it's a concept, if it's an already available product in the market. And we connect all these technologies to the demands of our clients. So, but to begin with our masterclass, I wanted to actually talk how this masterclass was a product of a beginning of a partnership and a friendship too, I may say. When I first talked to Roger, it was on LinkedIn. He was joining an event and he was talking about science fiction and innovation. And I was like super interested because I talk about this, but mostly in Portuguese, since I'm Brazilian. And and then I asked him if I could see his material. And in the end, we arranged a call, we talked, and we saw that we had a lot of interests in common and some complementary qualities too. So we started working together in a project of content, and we are writing about innovation, disruption, philosophy, all the things that Disruptive Futures Institute works with. And one of the outcomes of this partnership was this joint article published at magazine, and it represents both of our viewpoints on science fiction, innovation, and business opportunities too. But above all things, it was the state of our reality that inspired us to think about the importance of using science fiction as a means to accelerate innovation or actually make sense of all this chaotic time we are living in, especially now with COVID-19. And I guess this quote by Arthur C. Clarke is very evocative. He said that fiction is more than non-fiction in some ways. You can create a universe of your own. You can stretch people's mind, alerting them to the possibilities of the future, which is very important in an age where things are changing rapidly. But bear in mind that Clarke died in 2008, meaning that if he thought that it was already too fast back in the day, now things are even faster. It's like we are taking a shortcut in a wormhole, right? So in spite of making things a bit more scarier, I think science fiction or fictions in general are even more important now as a means to actually arrange or organize our reality in terms of narratives. And then we can see what's happening and see how we can deal with it in a speculative atmosphere. So it's safer for us to try possible actions towards our future. And then I think this is your part, right?
No, that's great. And well, it's everyone's part and both of us.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, we organize like that.
No, so this is a fun one. It's just with Lydia, we thought we'd take a step back and just put a half a dozen ideas, which some time ago seemed probably pretty absurd or impossible, and which then became reality. And so Jules Verne actually imagined in his book, The Earth to the Moon, that we would go to the moon. And he wrote about that in 1865. So just over 100 years before 1969, when the first man was on the moon. Or Edouard Bellamy, who wrote Looking Backwards, and he wrote it in 1888, effectively for the first time, I guess, describing what is a credit card. Or Arthur C. Clarke, which Lydia just mentioned, which was talking about in 1945, radio signals bouncing off satellites for long distance communications. And guess what? A few years later, in 1957, Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1. And then Dick Tracy, quite some time ago, before the iWatch came out, with the two-way wristwatch or Knight Rider. So these are some of the fun anecdotes. I think maybe just one point to notice, it's not necessarily on these particular examples, but with the exponential and accelerating pace of change, the gap of time between science fiction and science fact is probably reduced all the time. So we looked with Lydia at quite an interesting study, which was done by Philip Jordan at the University of Hawaii, which, as many of you know, one of the leading universities for foresight and many other things. And this was picked up by an article in MIT Technology Review. But effectively, Philip Jordan et al., they studied the way researchers in human-computer interactions found the usage of the terms science fiction in their work. And you can see the graph that it increases quite considerably over the past, I'd say, 10, 15 years. And the observations were that science fiction plays a significant role for human-computer interactions, which he took as a proxy, but that was, to be able to be consistent with the material he had and the data. But effectively, it's increasingly mentioned, even though the data he has, as we mentioned, is a specific example. So it's just the tip of the iceberg. And so it's just a fraction of the instances and the actual inspiration of science fiction. But it still shows that the exploration of new forms for human-computer interface and the availability and number of mentions in scientific papers that are unrelated to science fiction per se was increasing at quite a steady pace over the years, and that continues, of course. So when we look at different industries, and I can talk from 20 years of M&A, where I advised a lot of the incumbent leading companies and who saw many new industries and many new players come out of nowhere and pretty much eat their lunch, even though they had been maybe established global leaders for decades. And so this is where you can see the importance of imagination and innovation. And whether it's for automotive, where it's not the OEMs, it's not Ford, it's not Volkswagen, it's not the European or the US auto manufacturers, but it's players like Waymo or Tesla, or even more interestingly, NVIDIA, which is a chip manufacturer, which is pretty much going to be the operating system for the automotive industry. When you look at on the food side, it's not the leaders like Tyson or others, it's Beyond Meat or Impossible, which had the imagination for sustainable food tech and breaking the molds of the industry leaders like the Tyson Foods. Likewise, in payments, you don't see First Data for payment processing, you don't see the banks or Amex, it's players like Adyen or Ant Financial in China, PayPal, Square. Space, of course, the commercial space is the partnerships with NASA, where they're trying to commercialize space and make it more cost effective. Is through the commercial players. And in tech, media, telecom, one of the most interesting areas I find is, it's only in 2017 that Disney took over BAMTech for streaming and took the control over that, whereas Netflix for for quite some time had been working on that. Or Zoom, it's only this year that Verizon realized that they needed to buy a small company called Blue Jeans to do enterprise-grade video calls, which Zoom had been building for years. And so all of these things, it's really having the imagination and innovation as to what might be coming in the future. Now, one area which I find quite important is that this beginner's mind is a reoccurring relevance and responsibility to stay relevant. And this is actually a calligraphy of a friend of mine, Nai, and this is Shoshin, the concept in Japan, which is the beginner's mind. Sho means first time, and Shin is the mind and spirit. And so it's what Bezos uses in his own words, every day is day one. You need to stay relevant all the time. And so it's more than just sessions from time to time where you become imaginative. It's really thinking about what does it take every day to have that beginner's mind. And Tesla, as an example, is a great example, because Tesla, it's not just that they've done electric vehicles a few years before others, it's that they are a software company. It's that every day they understand, and they have probably 10, 15 years ahead of the manufacturers. They understand that you need to be a software company. They can basically update and roll out a new software in moments. And not only that, but they understand that they actually need to be an energy company. They understand what it is to develop the million-mile battery, and what their valuation, which is now about $600 billion, is driven by the fact that they've turned themselves into an energy company and actually not an automotive manufacturer. Or if you look at Slack, which has its origins in gaming, and Slack, which was only created in 2009, which was just acquired for close to $30 billion by Salesforce, to help it compete against the Microsofts of the world on enterprise software. And so you can see something that happened through gaming that was very clever, but that had online productivity tools that fundamentally changed the way people work, has its origins in online gaming. And that everyday innovation and imaginative way meant that it ended up being, in pretty much only 10 years, able to help compete against the likes of Microsoft, which was created, I think, in 1975. And the $30 billion tag, which Salesforce paid for Slack, is probably the second or third largest software acquisition ever made. So this is where, you can see that it's a sandbox for innovation. You can see that when you have unconstrained external perspective, when you can imagine alternative realities or things which seem impossible, you're really not thinking about the future. You're actually thinking about your present. You're actually thinking about starting to develop and to imagine products, ideas today. And that imagination that becomes reality is fascinating because, of course, you have the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezos and all of these guys and many others who are very fascinated by science fiction. But if you take the movie, for instance, Minority Report in 2002, when Alex McDowell, who was a production designer, produced that, as a result of that, there were probably 100 patents on ideas which were floated in the movies, which were filed. And so you can see the way science fiction movie like Minority Report literally influenced the future, from driverless cars to wearables tech to 3D videos, biometrics, etc. So what companies use science fiction? Well, actually, many companies, not just tech companies, but a lot of the companies which are legacy or traditional industries. Lowe's, for instance, which is for home improvement in the US, combines augmented reality, virtual reality, and spatial computing for the customer experiences. Now, that is not a new idea today. IKEA, most of the players do, but a few years ago it was, and they came about it through a partnership and through brainstorming with Made in Space. They were thinking about producing home equipment tools, literally in the ISS station, the International Space Station in space. Or when you look at Intel, which is really trying to, it's the only large semiconductor player which is really competing against NVIDIA for the next generation of operating systems for cars, which is able to decode the implications of pervasive computational intelligence with sentient tools to understand convergent smart cities, autonomous systems, the convergence of AI, of 5G, of Internet of Things, and what all that will mean. And so they understand that the chips and the AI chips that they're developing need to be something which imagines a completely different world of mobility as opposed to just cars. And that is probably quite unique in most of the semiconductor players who are still assuming that the world is linear, stable, and predictable, and that they just produce semiconductor chips for the rest of the companies. So you can't go wrong with chocolate. Hershey's, as an example, they use science fiction a lot, and haven't tasted it, but just for the kicks, this is a 3D printing machine of chocolates. But they, I think the idea here is they're thinking of a world where you pretty much produce chocolate at home or wherever you are. So why do companies, and we talk about companies, but actually innovation and imagination is as important, if not more, for individuals and for anyone. It could be governments, it could be all of us. It's not for companies necessarily, but why do companies, as an example here, use it? Well, the primary reason is that it's very, very hard to have imagination in the real sense, to imagine something that you cannot, that's just seems impossible, or even worse than impossible. You don't have the idea, you don't know what you don't know. And so I love in Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll's book, Believing Impossible Things. At some point you have the queen who's speaking to Alice, and who used to say, as a child, I used to try and think about as many impossible things before breakfast. And she was quite proud, the queen, that at some point she was able to think of 6 impossible things before breakfast time. And you really see through this analogy how difficult it is, but imagination can beat any strategic return analysis or any type of, short-term linear financial analysis. It starts conversations on areas which you can think about and develop. You can then ideate and invent things you might not have thought about, injecting some crazy views, which again helps expand perceptions around assumptions you might make to explore products, productions, technologies. Also thinking about an area where Lydia spends a lot of time, the social impact, the human side, the ethical considerations around the products, because you're projecting in a world where these are concrete. And you're doing that in a way that's not constrained, whether it's financial, whether it's technology, or whether it's simply the constraints of reality and our small, sometimes quite specific minds where we think about the world and with a lot of assumptions and constraints. Here you have a complete blank page. So the real foundation is really a simple question. And we all know the power of questions, and some of the greatest inventions have arisen through simple questions. And this question here is what if? What if we were to challenge the assumptions? What if we were to question these? What if we were able to reconcile short-term thinking, emergence with some long-term perspectives and not assume that there's a choice between the two? What if we were thinking more broadly in terms of systems and the impact and the next order implications of things? What if we built in the storytelling? What if we transformed culture and integrated everything in a way where we prototyped all that through ideas, as opposed to having different specialist teams focus on a specific known problem? So this is really the foundation. It's really that simple question, which is, what if?
And when we talk about science fiction, we should not see these narratives only as a fictional genre in which you will list some technologies and try to turn them into actual products or projects. In fact, my narratives are actually reflections on the consequences of these technologies or in changes we may see in our society. Take these great dystopias of the past century, for instance. The book We by Zamiatin speaks about a society where there's no privacy at all. People live in buildings made of glass and obey to a totalitarian government. Same goes for Huxley's Brave New World, but with a twitch when you think that Soma is the perfect drug that makes everyone happy and sound. And it's funny to think that back in the day, this story was considered a dystopia where people were alienated by drugs. But today, if we could actually bypass the stages of adapting to psychiatric drugs, maybe we would be more happy or happier actually if we had Soma to solve all the problems we have, and after trying so many different drugs or medicine actually. And well, if you also consider 1984, a classic, very often quoted as a reference for problems such as privacy, it's very interesting to see how Orwell envisioned this society, totalitarian society, where information is manipulated, war is eternal, and people have no privacy, not even in their thoughts. I love the concept of a thought police, for instance. Even in your thoughts, you could be committing a crime, a thought crime. I love this concept. And well, I love in a sense of thinking about this, of reflecting on this concept, not that this is ideal. And also, you have this collection of short stories, I, Robot, by Isaac Asimov, in which he addresses how our world, this is Night City, São Paulo. That's the city that inspired Cyberpunk 2077, and this is it. Anyways, in 1950, Isaac Asimov wrote this collection of short stories, I, Robot, in which he discusses a world where robots are actually kind of household electronics. They're so often and so common in human life that we have another kind of society and other problems to be discussed too. In fact, Asimov was so important as both a fictional writer and a philosopher, or a scientist, because he was in fact a biologist, that he created 3 rules of robotics that he uses along his fiction. But even nowadays, they are used as references for people who work with artificial intelligence and robotics. Even though they are kind of limited nowadays, they are still an inspiration to think about the ethics of AI and robotics. And well, it started as a concept for fictional scenarios, and now we can use this even in scientific contexts of research. To this point, even Honda made a kind of gift or dedication to Asimov when they created this robot called Asimo. And well, you can see that the connection between science fiction and scientific innovation can be as clear or literal as that. But on the other hand, we cannot say that futurists or science fiction authors, writers can actually predict the future. That wouldn't be not honest. In fact, when we see books like Future Shock by Alvin Toffler, we see he's saying that no serious futurist deals with in prediction, because nobody can really predict the future, but we can think about it and maybe build strategies on how to transform this future into something that we wish for or we aim for. And then one of the ways to do this is through this methodology called design fiction. One of the first people to suggest this methodology was science fiction writer Bruce Sterling. And basically, he describes design fiction as a deliberate use of diegetic prototypes to suspend disbelief about change. Okay, what are diegetic prototypes? Prototypes can be anything. They could be a prop, a movie, a short story. They could be even a performance, provided that it talks, it dialogues, it speaks with us and makes us believe in this scenario it's created throughout this prototype. And it must be very well built and convincing to the point that we actually believe that scenario and we think about the consequences and why is it desirable or not desirable, preferable, is it possible? We actually dive into this fictional scenario and then we can actually think about the possibilities to avoid or to make this fictional scenario true. And at Envisioning, we did also this first project, not the first project with Swiss Army, but it was the first time we tried to combine science fiction with future casting or trend foresight. And then we did this project back in 2019, I guess, no, 18. And we mapped emerging technologies, fictional technologies in works like Neuromancer, Blade Runner 2049, 2001, A Space Odyssey, and a game called Detroit Become Human. So we made a comparison between the fictional technologies we saw in these movies, games, and books, and we connected to actual technologies or projects, concepts that are still being researched, and put a rank according to NASA's TRL, Technology Readiness Level. So there is a difference between 1 and 9. 1 is an idea or a concept, and 9 is already a product you can buy, and it's already known by people in general. This year, however, we did another project using science fiction, and we created 4 interactive narratives. One of them was created by me, and I'm going to show this project for you guys, because it's very interesting the way we work it using science fiction narratives that you can actually, it's like a game. You can choose what you want for the main character. For instance, this is my story, Legaco, and it's about transhumanism, life extension, biotechnology, mind uploading. And then you can choose whatever you want for the story to carry on. And you have along the story several technologies that are in different stages of readiness. For instance, we have Avatar. We already have Avatar as a real, actual functional technology nowadays. So we can see a short description of what is an avatar and actually open a radar with all the technologies we mapped in the other stories as well. So here you can see the map, the radar, the visualization. Envisioning has this proprietary visualization for emerging technologies, and you can check all the descriptions and all the level of readiness for each technology. So yeah, this is available on our website. You just need to visit us at envisioning.io. So back to the presentation. Oh, thank you, Yasmin. She sent the link on the chat. Another way to try to put science fiction in a more strategical way is also this kind of framework, such as Futures will. So you have this design where you can take a first trend or event or even a new technology, and you can think about the consequences, the developments of this technology. So let's say, for instance, CRISPR and how some scientists could be editing embryos. So what are the possible consequences, positive, negative, neutral? And then you can try to think about these ramifications of possible developments after all. There is also another methodology called future cone, where you do almost the same. You have this cone that represents visually the passage of time, and you can put different scenarios throughout this cone, and you can make it closer to nowadays or further in the future. And there's different futures, actually. There's the possible future, a plausible future, a probable future, and a preferable future. So people can choose what scenarios are really that they believe it's possible or that they would like to live in. So it's a way to make this more strategical and make it easy for people to imagine and create these scenarios, these narratives. Another way is this card game called The Thing from the Future, where you can make cards, like you print cards and you have an object. For instance, in this image, you have a jury, you have an emotion or feeling. In this case, we can see shame. You have a wild card, which could be the time when this story can happen. So in 5 years, in the present, in 100 years. And then you have the possible outcomes. It's basically inspired by Dator's frameworks of narrative. So it could be a transformative narrative. It could be a continuation of what we have in the present. And then people can use it to create any kind of diegetic prototype. So it could be a story, it could be a project, it could be a prop. I had some workshops where the people who participated create a short scene and they interpreted as if they were actors. So there's a lot of possibilities when you have these kind of frameworks to work with narrative creations. In fact, we have even a workshop on Saturday, but it's only in Portuguese for science fiction creative writing. And also when we were talking about this project and the narrative of Legaco, if you are interested in the future of that, we also have another panel about that. So I highly recommend you to follow this. And yeah, here are some examples then of this connection between science fiction and science fact. You can take from them. Roger,
Fantastic.
Please.
So I'm going to pause a few moments just to address one or two of the questions. So a few things. First of all, for those who haven't read or come across the future narratives, it's really amazing because it's a combination of emerging tech, meets science fiction, meets interactivity, and of course Lydia's one is phenomenal, Legaco, if you haven't read it. So that's really great fun. And there are two questions. I'm just going to take a break now, 2 minutes. We will have Q&A later, and Lydia, please chime in as well, or we can discuss it later. But just two questions that I saw pop up, and we might as well just cover them now. One was Fabio. I think if I remember the question, it was around why we just talking about companies and technology. What about swarm intelligence or other factors? A few thoughts there from my personal perspective. I think, first of all, I don't personally see technology as a particular sector or type of company or anything. I think technology is pretty pervasive now across any company, any industry. Whether one likes that or not, it's a very sort of overwhelming, pervasive aspect. And the second thing I would say is that we're mentioning companies in the context of corporate innovation, but it's not necessarily linked to limitations or to companies. It doesn't have to be linked to companies. I think on the contrary, it's a fantastic tool for individuals. And the limitations of companies are because of also the challenges and the cognitive bias humans have in thinking about certain things. So we use companies, but at the end of the day, companies are just individuals, and the individuals in companies have a cognitive bias, have trouble imagining the impossible. And therefore, these are frameworks where you might find it useful whether you're swarm intelligence and crowdsourcing or an individual or parent or company, but we're not necessarily thinking that this is just a sort of corporate environment.
Sure, I agree with Roger. And also, I think this question comes from someone who likes cyberpunk, I guess. So I can see the inspiration there. And we hope someday Cypherpunk Manifesto and Cyberpunk Manifesto can be actually turning to reality, at least from my part. But yeah, for now, it's basically what Roger is saying.
And then there was a second question around, predictive modeling and how come they didn't see the pandemic, or does predictive modeling work? Again, only talking from my personal perspective, but a few things. First of all, for those who are interested in statistics and those kind of considerations, I really encourage you, if you don't know him well, to read Nicholas Nassim Taleb. He'll have very interesting and critical views around predictions, numbers, statistics, and that. And those are pretty critical to really understand the limitations of statistics and probabilities, especially with the tail end and anti-fragile and fragile. So more for some other time, but do read Nicholas Nassim Taleb if you're interested in that. The second thing I would say around predictive modeling is that I personally believe that we are today in a very complex world. And a complex world for me is a world where things are the unknown unknowns. Cause and effects can only be determined ex post. And in addition to that, there are no right answers, which is different from a complicated world where there are known unknowns, where you can determine cause and effect ex ante, and where there are a range of right answers. Now, that difference between complex and complicated, actually AI is very good in a complicated world because there are known unknowns and because there is cause and effect. And there's a range of right answers. And AI is good in that, and predictive modeling can be okay in that. But like many people believe, including not least Stephen Hawkins, the 21st century is a century of complexity. And therefore, some of the features of complexity are potentially limitations in terms of predictive modeling. Anyway, that's my personal view for what it's worth, just interjecting.
No, I agree. Go on.
So now to the examples, let's have some fun. And this is where, you have a number of these situations where some of the venture capital companies or even investors or even companies are looking for the more close to science fiction the ideas are, the more they'll invest. So there's actually a lot of startups and a lot of money going into these companies. Arctop is a very interesting Israeli cybernetics company in brain-computer interface. They moved recently, and I met them in Israel. They moved recently to San Francisco, actually. And they have an AI-based platform which constructs a multi-dimensional map of real-time brain activity. So you're thinking materializing Netflix's Bandersnatch using neural interfaces, basically. And their software is NEOS, and they use proprietary algorithms to decode pretty much emotion, tension, and memory straight from the brain's signals. So they're going through billions of neurons for that. So pretty scary or interesting, depending on how one thinks about it. And another one, which is interesting, is core actions. Interesting / scary. You all know about Minority Report, or many of you will, and if you don't, check it out. But what is Core Actions doing? They're developing non-invasive software which identifies human intentions, to prevent what might be a disastrous human-machine interface error. So effectively, how close are you to anticipating what someone might do, and maybe you might get arrested if you're thinking in the wrong way? So we all love to love and love to hate Facebook, right? So Facebook acquired neural interface platform, an impulse armband called Control Labs. They bought it for $500 million to $1 billion. And it's not the brain neural impulses that it's measuring, it's just the electrical impulses for now from the arms. But how close are we? And is that the precursor to brain-computer interface? But what we're going to look at now on the next slide is when Facebook combines its projects around smart glasses, when it has Project Orion, and Facebook has a strategic partnership with Ray-Ban, whose parent is Luxottica, which is one of the largest glass manufacturers in the world. And this is reportedly going to be designed to take calls without necessarily being tethered to a smartphone. It's going to stream videos. And so what you're seeing is Oculus that's dematerializing sensors, controllers, and the smartphone itself to interact digitally in augmented environments. So you're pretty close to some of the things you might kind of think about as science fiction. This is an amazing company, Mojo Vision. In fact, Lydia and I were speaking to the founder, Drew, earlier this week. And imagine it or not, but this is actually a lens. They've raised $150 million, a little bit more to date, and they're working on an augmented reality contact lens. And so this is really invisible computing. It's reducing the friction between information and the brain. You have the smallest, densest dynamic display ever made. I think the pixel density is 300 greater than the best smartphones available. It has advanced R&D with biocompatible materials for embedded electronics. So not only do you have embedded electronics in the lens, but pretty much it replaces the ophthalmologist and the visits you might need to do for the medical. So I hope not too many of you are training for that, because you might have a lens that kind of replaces it. And basically it has power, sensors, and communication. So it's a biosafe, rechargeable battery innovations so that it's autonomous. So I'll let you just imagine what's going on in that little lens. And of course, you can choose any color you want. So how cool is that? Or scary? Now, Ready Player One, many of you might have seen that and know it. And a little company called Haptics, which raised $19 million, which is building the first haptic telerobotic system to transmit touch and feedback to an operator anywhere. And this is very, very fascinating. There's actually researchers from Cornell University who are also developing a new pair of fiber optic gloves with sensors that track the hands with extreme precision. So it makes it possible to add tactile feedback to the virtual reality experiences. So why is all this noteworthy? Well, the primary reason is because none of these developments in terms of technology are happening in isolation. What's happening is that you have convergence and fusion with digital synergies between 5G, between Internet of Things, between sensors, augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality, and of course, artificial intelligence. So with artificial intelligence and machine learning, you have deep learning, natural language processing. And that meets artificial and immersive reality. You no longer know whether you're in real virtual life or in virtual real life. And then you meet some of the technology around brain-computer interface or cybernetics, the brain-computer communications. And so what happens when you can see, hear, touch, or feel with the tech and the wearables? And that is also being combined and fused with the smell, with digital sense. So the reason we put this quote from Michio Kaku around, once confined to fantasy and science fiction, time travel is simply an engineering problem, is because of the convergence and the fusion of all these technologies. When you have all the immersive, the brain-computer interface, you can see, touch, and feel, you can smell with digital scent, you have new materials technology or holographic displays and breakthroughs in nano manufacturing and nano engineering. How close are you then to digital teleportation or to space travel or to cyberspace or to time travel? And that is why we put this quote here and we're illustrating it, because none of these technologies are static. They evolve quite quickly, exponentially, and they don't evolve in isolation. So as they converge and fuse, that's when you end up with all these science fiction, science fact.
And well, last but not least, we want to show this video. Maybe some of you guys already saw it, but I think it's a great way to wrap up our panel, because basically what we see is Arthur C. Clarke, who was a scientist. He was a physicist and mathematician, and he basically talks about what he predicts for the year of 2001. But the great combination is that he had the scientific knowledge and he had the ability to imagine and to speculate narratives. So when you see this interviewer asking him about the future, you can see the power of you have when you combine both scientific knowledge and imaginative tools to create. So yeah.
Maybe 2001, you're projecting us into the 21st century. I brought along my son Jonathan, who in the year 2001 will be the same age as I am now. Maybe he will be better adjusted to this kind of world that you're trying to portray.
The big difference when he grows up, in fact, if we wanted to wait for the year 2001, is that he will have in his own house, not a computer as big as this, but at least a console through which he can talk to his friendly local computer and get all the information he needs for his everyday life, like his bank statements, his theater reservations, all the information you need in the course of living in a complex modern society. This will be in a compact form in his own house. He'll have a television screen like these here and a keyboard, and he'll talk to the computer, get information from it, and he'll take it as much for granted as we take the telephone.
I wonder though, what sort of a life would it be like in social terms? I mean, if our whole life is built around the computer, do we become a computer-dependent society and computer-dependent individuals?
In some ways, but they'll also enrich our society because it'll make it possible for us to live really anywhere we like. Any businessman and executive could live almost anywhere on Earth and still do his business through a device like this. And this is a wonderful thing. It means we want to be stuck in cities, we better live out in the country or wherever we please, and still carry on complete interaction with human beings as well as with other computers.
I find this video fantastic because basically what he sees is like a future where you have a lot of technological developments and new technologies that could make us, for instance, live in the country, but still work and have contact with other people and other machines. And now during COVID-19, we saw that because basically we had all the technologies available to have remote work years ago, but our society didn't want this before. We needed a pandemic to adapt to this new format of remote work. And even so, we tried to run to the hills, basically, but the rent prices also increased. So there's a lot of complicated things, human elements that maybe are not really addressed by some science fiction writers or some futurists. And this is why I always say that it's important to have diversity when writing science fiction and also working with futurists, because you need different viewpoints about the future and consequences that come with social change and also new technologies. And there's a quote by Bruce Sterling too. It's very interesting because if you consider that the history of women were never before studied before 1970s, it's like ignoring the history of more than half of the population of the world. So we need to have different viewpoints for the future. And that's why I always stress we need diversity in science fiction and also in futurism. So yeah, this is it. Thank you so much. And we're here for questions and debates and anything you want.
And by the way, for everyone, when Lydia showed, I think it was the 3 laws of robots of Asimov, that I think is 1950, so 70 years ago. And that's basically pretty much some of the key considerations of most of the ethics committees today on AI.
Exactly. So I guess there are some questions we didn't reply around along the panel. I will recover some of them. We answered about the corporations, companies. And there, Clarice asked, it would be great to hear your vision around the difference between design fiction and speculative design. I've never came across any clear article that defined the difference between the two approaches. Well, there's an actual connection between the two approaches, but I guess maybe design fiction is more focused on science fiction, not necessarily with other kinds of fiction, as you can see, or speculative narratives when you talk about speculative design. But in the end, they are emerging, I guess, design fiction is even more recent than speculative design. So these are two different methodologies that are still developing and getting a real, like, structured, sorry, sometimes it's language barriers and my tongue is like confused. But anyways, they're still being structured. It's not really that clear, the difference for now, at least from my perspective and the studies I did. Do you want to add anything, Roger?
No, not on that. I just want to come back maybe to the diversity point which Lydia made, because one of the interesting aspects, the two aspects which cross my mind. One is the unintended consequences and the next order implications. And so projecting quite far ahead, and science fiction is a tool, it's not the only tool, allows one to take into account all these different perspectives, and that's obviously critical. But I want to just link it also to the discussion we had earlier around predictive models and complexity and versus complicated. And without wanting to dwell too much on the specific point, because in a complex world, you don't necessarily have the right answers, and you can't rely just on specialists because they're unknown unknowns, and causality is only determined ex post. In order to experiment and to emerge and to know what to amplify in terms of the right feedback loops versus dampen and stop, you have to have diverse perspectives and multiple different kind of experimentation, because it's really the only way you will emerge in a complex environment with sort of some answers and emerge with answers which seem to make sense. And so science fiction, which draws upon that element of diversity, is critical, as with any system which is not linear, stable, or predictable. And so that's where I think science fiction in particular is one which almost draws that as a natural state, because by definition, you have a blank page. You're thinking about the next order implications, and therefore you have to integrate all of these different possible considerations. And diversity is obviously one of the critical ones.
So Boris sent a question. You mentioned Taleb and Kaku as futurists and important tech philosophers, writers. Any other you actively follow and recommend? Do you want to start, Roger?
Yeah. So there are many. I think I think there are different fields and different kind of expertise. There are a lot of very important people in the future studies, and obviously Envisioning, who's hosting this, is doing so under the banner of UNESCO and Futures Literacy. And within Futures Literacy, there's a lot of events taking place all week, and there are a lot of very, very well-known people, including an amazing panel on anticipatory systems, and which is taking place, I think, tomorrow under the UNESCO banner, with people like Roberto Poli and Riel Miller and Wendy Schultz and a few others, who are some of the leaders in futures, and who are actually part of a stream of futures called anticipatory systems. And so there's a lot of those talks. So check out the UNESCO website on futures literacy. There's aspects which are also not purely, but which are very much emerging technologies. And so there are people like Ray Kurzweil, there are people like Peter Diamandis, there are a lot of people who, I wouldn't say they only have a focus on emerging technologies, but it's certainly one of the areas that's a strong focus on. There's so many. We can maybe follow up separately. What I would say though, maybe, and I'll let Lydia add her amazing input as well, but part of the remit of the Disruptive Futures Institute is to give a better sense of what's happening and who to follow and what to look at. And so we're writing quite a lot of things, including a book jointly with Lydia, which will come out in H1 2021. And there'll be a lot of resources there, a lot of guidance on who to follow, who to read, and all that. So if you generally follow on social media, Disruptive Futures Institute, as well as the many other wonderful organizations, we will be very intentionally guiding towards what we feel are very good resources. But Lydia, over to you.
Yeah, well, I would just add that there are some authors I follow that are not necessarily futurists, but they talk about future topics like cyber feminism or transhumanism. So there's Monica Bielskite, who's she mostly talks about the concept of protopia and indigenous futures too. There's authors working on Afrofuturism that I follow, several authors. I can send you a list of references I use constantly, links and websites I follow. But mostly I read some theories that are not necessarily futurists. I like very much Douglas Rushkoff. He used to be a writer that was very enthusiastic about cyberspace back in the 90s. he wrote the book Siberia, and nowadays he does very hard or very crucial criticism towards Silicon Valley and all the corporate culture in technology and singularity mostly. So yeah, and also there's what's her name again? Margaret Worthing. She wrote a very interesting book I use for my PhD called The Pearly Gates of Cyberspace. And she gives a historical panorama of how we developed our sense of individuality and our perception of space since Dante's Inferno until nowadays with cyberspace. So there's a lot of different resources I use. And even I'm reading now a book called This History of Future by Georges Minois. I don't know if there is a translation in English, but there is in French and Portuguese. And it's very interesting to see how throughout the history of the Western societies, we always had someone talking about the future, being it through astrology or futurology. So it's very interesting to see how what we are doing right now, it's something that is crucial and very in the roots of our societies.
And Lydia, you, I mean, for those who didn't pick up at the intro, Lydia is actually amongst her many talents, a professional journalist, and she writes a column for YOL and many other things. So I think just following Lydia on social media as well is a phenomenal wealth of references and culture.
Yeah.
And that.
Actually, when I met Bruce Sterling, he signed my book, saying that my name would be Wikilydia because I have a lot of references like Wikipedia. So you can follow me and I can give you more insight. That's
Bruce Sterling saying that Lydia is Wikilydia. So you can imagine how much wealth there is there. So I was just thinking there's one question here, which
maybe Andre McQueen?
Let's see. Which one is it, Lydia?
Andre McQueen sent a question about Octavia Butler. And there's also Eduardo's question. Do you think that the recent technological advances are making it harder or easier to science fiction authors? It's harder because reality is more chaotic and making no sense. Whereas when you write fiction, you need to be rational and convince people that scenario is possible, but reality is much crazier than we can make in fiction. So yeah, it's hard times for science fiction writers.
So I'm obviously less of an expert, and I'm not myself a science fiction writer on that. So I'll give my kind of slightly more a different perspective. I think I would agree that it's probably harder for science fiction writers, although I don't know for a fact. And so Lydia's answer works better because she actually is a science fiction writer. But what I would say is that the way I perceive it is that the gap between science fiction and science fact, to Lydia's points about reality being crazy, is reduced. And some of it is because of the world being, people understanding that the world is not something which is straightforward, predictable, linear. Some of it is also, and I don't want to say everything is technology, but I think technology has an important role in that. In other words, the examples we looked at with the movies, with specific startups, are technology driven. And these technologies are advancing quite quickly for some of them. And even if you think about space and space exploration, or if you think about some of the specific technologies, and when you then think about the fusion and the convergence of all these technologies, that much more so. So I guess the question for me is really, are we limited to that and to imagining that, and how far can we stretch the imagination? And I guess, and again, Lydia's probably better to talk about these things than me, but when you think about some of the areas like solar punk or aspirational, should one be thinking about making that the reality with regeneration and climate and some of the other areas, as opposed, and that was a very good question, I think, from Fabio, to having it too technology centric? What is the role of imagination and I guess science fiction? And maybe I'll throw that question to you, Lydia, for for some of the things which are not the day-to-day emerging tech, which are not the more obvious around space, and how do you perceive that as interesting enough for the science fiction genre, credible enough? What do you have a view on some of the more maybe slightly alternative areas?
Well, it depends, because science fiction is a broader genre. You have many other subgenres inside science fiction, like solar punk, cyberpunk, steampunk, diesel punk, biopunk. There's a lot of punks, and also like retrofuturism, afrofuturism. And then I connect to Andrea's question about Octavia Butler, because she became a very strong reference when we talk about Afrofuturist perspective, races, and well, alongside Samuel, what's his name? I forgot, Delany. Yeah, Samuel Delany. He was a contemporary writer to Octavia Butler. And Andrea said that this approach maybe doesn't appear to be taken by brands and lecturers such as this, despite societal, I don't know how to pronounce that, societal conversations around diversity and representation being extremely important in 2020 alone. Do you see this changing? Well, we are trying to do our part. I try to bring these ideas when I give my talks, and there's people like Monica Bielski talking about indigenous futures. And Envisioning, we try to bring all these different perspectives too. If you check our Medium publication, you can see, for instance, some texts we wrote for the future of cities. And then you can see different aspects and that are not necessarily the mainstream opinion on only business, but also social change and also politics, sustainability, and so on. But to answer Roger's question and also Fabio's, I think it depends on the kind of question you're addressing and what the problem you would like to solve. Because, for instance, in the fiction of Ursula K. Le Guin, you have lots of discussions about gender roles, or maybe different economic and political systems in a planet. It's capitalism in its moon, it's anarchism, and how this works in this fictional scenario. So you need to find what is your interest, and then you can find most of the topics being addressed either in literature, cinema, games. Science fiction is a very rich genre, and you can find in any kind of format different perspectives on the future and different issues too. I don't know if I answered, but it's a very broad answer, so I don't know how I can do this in some minutes only.
No, that's amazing.
And
what else do we have?
So there is reality, virtual reality, and science fiction. Virtual reality equals science fiction. No, not necessarily. Virtual reality is true. Like I always show my Oculus Rift. This is true. It's not science fiction anymore, but it's used to be. And well, actually, I was talking to someone on my LinkedIn that wanted to write an article about that there is no difference between reality, physical reality, and virtual reality. So in terms of philosophy, maybe there is no difference, but in terms of pragmatism, maybe it has a difference because it's physical or digital. Lydia, can you address the false dichotomy of art versus technology, or nature versus technology, language and categorization get in the way more than we realize sometimes? Yeah, I can write a PhD about that, actually. I'm joking, but it depends on the author. You can see some authors making this difference between nature and technology, nature and culture, but there are other authors that wouldn't make this difference. And language, you would have the perspective of linguistics, or you would have philosophy of language with Wittgenstein, for instance, who uses language as a means to approach reality. So I don't know how to answer this in a simple way. But yeah, it depends. It could be a false dichotomy, or it could be really distinct things depending on the author you're using as a reference. For me, I think there is a difference because I take the psychological perspective, for instance, from Ernest Becker, Denial of Death. Basically, he says that we try to repress nature power, nature forces, trying to repress our consciousness of death. And then we create art and technology as a means to survive, as a symbolic being, because we are not just animals, we are animals with a higher level of consciousness compared to other animals. So we create language, culture, technology as a means to oppose to nature's force. It's very philosophical, it's very sad maybe, but it's something I really dig to research, and we can talk more elsewhere. Thanks for the question, Rafa.
And I guess the question is, how does all this change if we all live in a simulation? Because apparently there's 50% chance that we all live in a simulation and that none of this is reality. So that's one of the things we have to spend a bit of time thinking about.
Yeah, that too. Because if you take like Nick Bostrom, he wrote that article about, are we living in a simulation? And many people, including Elon Musk, thought that maybe we are, or he thought we are. So it's very interesting to see this and very mind-blowing. You can be very crazy when you're researching and reading this kind of stuff. So yeah, we are past 6 minutes past, but we are free to keep talking, or in our social media. I think Yasmin put the links from our social media here. Sorry, there's a question by Ivan. I would like to ask you if you could talk a bit further about the connection of sci-fi movies and technological development. Thank you. Yeah, so if you check our radar for DevTech, Yasmin, if you can put the link for the DevTech, you can see the connection we've made for the movies and the games and real actual technologies and how we ranked them in terms of technology readiness level. So it's more clear there. You can see the text, also the introduction explaining how we did this. And we are actually writing an article, a paper about the methodology we used in this project. So hopefully we'll be presenting this in the near future, and it's going to be published too. So yeah, there's lots to be done.
So a good point by JT around being in a simulation does not necessarily make life less real. So yeah, I mean, the simulation I'm in, when I compare it to my life in a simulation versus my real life, I find distinct differences, but I see what you're saying, JT. Elon is also unsure, but he's unsure about many things, depending on.
Is there some example of past or recent sci-fi speculation about people wasting their life on narcissistic social media flow and gate community platform? Wow. Yeah, Black Mirror, yes. But more than that, yeah. One interesting fact about that, actually, I wanted to mention is I just read, what's his name again? Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism. And basically what he says is that many fictions address this criticism against capitalism and all these narcissistic social media and so on, all this consumerist culture we have nowadays. And it's basically, it's a kind of strategy from capitalism from his point of view, because then we feel satisfied from consuming, from reading, watching this kind of content, because then we feel like we are woke to this kind of problems. And then we buy and then we consume this kind of products. It's very scary when he brings in this way. But yeah, I mean, Black Mirror is the most recent title I can remember now in terms of narcissistic social media flow and gate community platforms. There's also Weird City, a series from YouTube. The first episode is marvelous because it's basically like a Tinder, and they matched two guys and they were like, whoa, I don't like guys, I'm not gay and so on, but if the algorithm united us, so maybe we are the perfect match. And then they started to talk, they go out, and then they actually fall in love. But then the company from this app says that no, we made a mistake, you weren't supposed to have a match. And then there's this discussion about algorithms and how real, how right they are in face of what they actually felt after meeting each other. So Yeah. Yeah, the concept of Maya. Yes, I love that. I actually use it in my fiction, but it's only in Portuguese for now. I want to translate it. But basically, my short stories are a connection between cyberpunk and Buddhism and Hinduism. And I use the concept of Maya as an inspiration when the main character, Lynx, tries to make difference between the virtual world and the real world, and she's a junkie and all those cyberpunk tropes everyone is tired of, but yeah, I like that. And also Bruce Sterling's Holy Fire. It's a very interesting book, and the name of the main character is Mia, but then she goes under a procedure of rejuvenating and she becomes Maya because they don't understand her name or whatever, and then there's this play with the terms. I interviewed him and he said that that's the case. Yeah, I was right. What else? Could you apply sci-fi science fiction methodologies to operational decision making, e.g. in a leave police hostage situation? Oh my God, Roger, that's for you.
To operational decision making. I mean, nothing springs to mind specifically, but I mean, I guess it depends what you mean by operational, whether it's kind of real time on the spot for something. I mean, have you used science fiction to imagine a situation you wouldn't have thought of? And then by virtue of having thought about it, if and when it arises, you're then better able to. So I think, I don't know about live hostage taking, but I think one of the things one looks at is ultimately the primary, one of the main reasons for using science fiction is for imagination. And so imagining different eventualities and possibilities that might arise, some that you want agency for and you want to build and you want to do, or some for which if they arise, you're better prepared. I guess that probably is helpful in that sense. Yeah, I don't know, Lydia, if you have anything to add. There's a nice question also on digital collective unconscious.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's sort of playing with sort of swarm intelligence and other kind of possibilities, but it is a theme.
Sorry. Yeah. Rafa asked, what about digital collective unconscious? Yeah. We consider technology separate from us, therefore it's in our shadow, to use Carl Jung's term. If we were to own it and see it as a reflection of us, it could turn into a white mirror as opposed to a scary black mirror. Yeah, if you consider the shadow from Jung's perspective as a means to transcend the dark parts of your own identity. But yeah, there's another concept called noosphere. I will write this on the chat, and it's widely used in the sense of a digital, virtual, collective unconscious. And you can see this term being explored in Serial Experiments Lane, which was the Japanese animation I studied in my first research, my undergraduate research, where everything started and now we are here. Psychofanti asked, what is your PhD about? Is it ongoing or already finished? I'm finishing it. It was supposed to be finished this year, but COVID saved me and gave me more time. But basically, it's about the history of art and how we try to transcend death with images, since the portraits from Renaissance until post-mortem photographs, and now more currently with digital or actually virtual avatars. So I study some artists, including Andy Warhol, Gottfried Helwine, Damien Hirst, and specifically the funeral of Michael Jackson, and finally Bjork and Grimes as inspirations to think about how these different artists approached the concept of trying to transcend death through images. So it's complicated, but it's basically that. And it's in Portuguese for now, but yeah, that's the problem. I need to write more in English so more people can have access to the content, but it's in the list. Thanks for asking.
So there's a question from Stephanie. I don't know if it was in the Q&A for everyone or just for, but I'm reading it up. I'm reading it just in case. Often in sci-fi, there seems to be the dichotomy between human ethics versus technology, as well as power versus the powerless. What are your thoughts, especially when talking about companies and the effects of tech on our world? And well, I mean, Lydia, chime in, but for me, one of the roles of science fiction and one of the roles of, foresight and futures more generally is actually to be very broad and multidisciplinary. And Lydia mentioned many times diversity. And I think the important thing are the unintended consequences and the next order implications. And so I personally think that science fiction is quite a strong way of thinking, not just about tech, but more broadly around human ethics and a lot of other areas, precisely because you're really imagining in a quite an intricate way all the different aspects of what life could be at a specific point in time. And that level of imagination, and then imagining also the negative and the risks, probably allows you, or hopefully forces you to sort of think more broadly about those things. As to then how they're integrated when people design products and all that, that's another matter. But Lydia, I know you spend a lot of time on these topics.
No, but I mean, there's many science fiction narratives that talk about these inequalities and so on. But sometimes it's difficult to address these kind of subjects in a corporate environment. But I always try to do this in bringing design fiction or science fiction as a reference instead of pointing the finger to actual problems that happen, like Musk's talking about Bolivia and so on. But you can use science fiction stories to address some real problems. Let's take, for instance, Handmaid's Tale. It's about reproductive rights. It's about sexism and so on. You don't need to point and say, oh, this is about Trump or Bolsonaro, but it's clear there. It's a metaphor. Actually, Margaret Atwood, which is the author of Handmaid's Tale, she says that science fiction doesn't talk about the future, but rather about the present, but in a more metaphorical way. So you can speculate and you can extrapolate what is actually happening. And then you can distance yourself from the actual problem and think that as if it was someone else's or from somewhere else. And then you have this distance to reflect and criticize the topic or the scenario. So yeah, I try to bring that using science fiction. And it's funny because not all the times people recognize the politics behind science fiction. Let's take the example of Cyberpunk 2077 and how in Twitter some people were super angry with CD Red Project because they didn't want to have a game addressing political stuff. And then everybody was like, but Cyberpunk is totally political. If it's not political, then it's not Cyberpunk. So it's very interesting to see how some things are born as politics, and then they become a product, and then they are emptied from this criticism they usually did. So cyberpunk, for instance, became as a subgenre that talks about cybernetic technologies from a punk perspective. So with a punk criticism and nihilism and the quote of no future brought from Sex Pistols, and then you have all the genre and all the tropes, all the concepts emptied as long as they become products in the end. So nowadays, cyberpunk, if you check some groups on Facebook, for instance, it's mostly to share the picture or illustrations of hot women with prosthetics. So it's sad, but yeah, commercialization. Yeah, that's the problem. It's always capitalism. Yeah, no, joking. Yeah. I'm kidding, but it's true.
Yeah.
All right. So any other questions, or shall we say goodbye and see you later on social media? Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining us. This session is being recorded. You can check afterwards on YouTube. And yeah, Michelle, yes, please.
Well, I just want to say goodbye and thank you so much for doing this, you guys. It was a wonderful conversation to listen into, and I'm judging from the Q&A, from the questions, everyone seemed to have felt that way. So thank you so much. Let's do more of this and advance the conversation, and sign up for other sessions. We have 2 more days ahead of us.
Yes.
We're still only a day into the summit, so I hope to see more of you guys.
Yes, please check our schedule. There's a lot of talks, very interesting talks hosted by Envisioning. I think there's a link here in the chat. So yeah, hope to see you again in the next panels.
Thanks everyone. And thanks Envisioning for having us. Ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.